The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing deployment schedules at my desk. My cousin's voice was tight with worry, cutting through the routine hum of the military base around me. "Sarah," he said, "you need to know what's happening with Grandpa Joe." The words that followed made my coffee grow cold in my hands. For 3 weeks, my grandfather had been deteriorating in ways that should have sent anyone running to the nearest emergency room. Weight loss that carved hollows in his cheeks. A cough that rattled his chest like something broken inside. Exhaustion so complete he could barely lift his head when visitors knocked. But there were no visitors anymore because my parents had made sure of that. They'd turned away neighbors bearing casseroles. They'd canceled his standing doctor appointments without telling him. They'd unplugged the phone in his room and told everyone who asked that he was simply resting. Resting, they called it, as if denial could cure pneumonia. I am Staff Sergeant Sarah Mitchell, United States Army Medical Corps, and I've spent the last 8 years learning how to save lives when time runs out. I've triaged wounded soldiers in field hospitals where every second counted. I've made split-second decisions that determined whether someone's family would receive a folded flag or a phone call saying their loved one was coming home. But nothing in my training had prepared me for a war fought in suburban living rooms against the people who were supposed to love him most. The authorization papers were already in my file cabinet at home, tucked between insurance documents and old deployment orders. 3 years earlier, when Grandpa Joe's health first started declining, he'd pulled me aside during a family barbecue. His hands were still steady then, his voice still strong. "Sarah," he'd said, "I need you to promise me something. If I can't speak for myself someday, I want you to be the one who does. You've got the backbone for hard decisions, and you won't let anyone push you around." We'd driven to the courthouse that same week. The notary's stamp had felt like a sacred seal on documents that granted me medical power of attorney. I never thought I'd need to use it. I certainly never imagined I'd have to use it against my own family. But that Tuesday morning, sitting at my desk with deployment schedules scattered around me, I realized the time for hoping had passed. My cousin's voice echoed in my memory as I pulled up my contact list and found the number I needed. Lieutenant Rodriguez answered on the second ring. His voice carried the efficiency of someone who'd handled countless emergency medical transports. "Rodriguez," I said, "I need a favor. I have a patient who's being denied necessary medical care. I have legal authority to intervene, and I need it done properly." There was a pause on the line, then the sound of papers rustling. "Send me the documentation," he replied. "We'll make it happen." The plan took shape over the next 48 hours with the precision of a military operation. Because that's exactly what it was. An extraction mission where the enemy wasn't a foreign combatant, but my own parents. And the objective wasn't securing territory, but saving the man who'd taught me what honor meant. I'd tried the diplomatic approach first. Phone calls that went nowhere. Reasonable conversations that hit walls of stubbornness disguised as concern. My mother's voice had been crisp and final when I'd suggested bringing Grandpa Joe to the VA hospital for evaluation. "He's comfortable at home," she'd said, as if comfort and medical neglect were the same thing. My father had been even more direct. "You're not here every day, Sarah. You don't see what we see. We know what's best for him. But I knew what I saw in the power of attorney documents, and I knew what the law said about medical decision-making. They didn't get to override legal authority with parental privilege." The morning of the operation, I pressed my dress uniform with the kind of care usually reserved for formal ceremonies. Each ribbon aligned perfectly, each button polished until it caught the light. The 2 silver bars on my collar gleamed like small declarations of the authority I'd earned through years of service and sacrifice. This wasn't about showing off. It was about showing up in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. When people see military dress blues, they see more than fabric and metal. They see structure, authority, and the weight of an institution that doesn't negotiate with civilian stubbornness when lives are at stake. The ambulance arrived at exactly 1400 hours, just as Lieutenant Rodriguez had promised. Not a screaming emergency vehicle that would send neighbors into panic, but a calm, professional medical transport that announced its purpose without apology. The crew stepped out in crisp uniforms, carrying equipment with the practiced efficiency of people who'd done this 1,000 times before. I met them at the curb, my dress uniform drawing stares from every window on the block. The lead medic, Sergeant Williams, nodded once in greeting. "Ma'am, we have the authorization paperwork, and Dr. Martinez is standing by at the VA facility. We're ready to proceed." The walk to my parents' front door felt like crossing a battlefield. Each step measured, deliberate, designed to project the kind of calm confidence that comes from knowing you're on the right side of both law and morality. Behind me, the medical team followed with their equipment, a portable gurney, and the quiet authority of people who don't ask permission to save lives. My mother opened the door before we reached the porch steps. Her face cycled through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been fear. She took in my uniform, the medic's, the official nature of what was unfolding in front of her neighbors, and her voice pitched higher than usual. "Sarah, what is this supposed to be?" She demanded. "Some kind of performance?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "Ma'am, I'm here in my capacity as Grandpa Joe's medical power of attorney. We're transporting him for necessary medical evaluation that has been delayed too long." My father appeared behind her, his face already reddening with the kind of anger that comes from losing control of a situation you thought you controlled absolutely. "You can't just show up here with an ambulance," he said. "This is our house, our decision." I pulled the folded documents from my jacket pocket and held them where both parents could see the official seals and signatures. "This is a legal medical transport authorized by properly executed power of attorney documents. You've been notified. You can cooperate or you can be reported for obstructing necessary medical care." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Around us, neighbors had emerged onto porches and driveways, drawn by the unusual sight of a military ambulance and uniformed personnel conducting official business on their quiet suburban street. The silence stretched between us like a tripwire waiting to snap. My mother's eyes darted from the documents in my hand to the neighbors gathering on their porches, then back to my face. She was calculating something, weighing her options against the growing audience of witnesses who could no longer be ignored or dismissed. Behind me, Sergeant Williams cleared his throat softly. "Ma'am, we need to proceed with the medical evaluation. Time is a factor in cases like this." My father stepped forward, his voice dropping to that threatening whisper he'd perfected during my teenage years. "You're embarrassing this family, Sarah. Making a scene over nothing. He's just tired. Old people get tired. I'd heard that phrase before. Just tired. It was the same thing they'd told concerned neighbors. The same excuse they'd given to family members who'd stopped by with worried questions. Just tired. As if exhaustion alone could explain away the dramatic weight loss, the labored breathing, the way Grandpa Joe had started sleeping 16 hours a day. "Where is he?" I asked, my voice cutting through their protests like a blade through paper. My mother's jaw tightened. "He's resting. Like I told you on the phone, he doesn't need to be dragged around by strangers who don't know his condition." Sergeant Williams stepped closer, his clipboard held at the ready. "Ma'am, I'm a certified emergency medical technician with 12 years of experience. Delaying medical care for someone presenting with the symptoms described can be life-threatening. We need to see the patient now." The word patient seemed to hit my parents like a physical blow. It stripped away their pretense that this was about family dynamics or personal preferences. It made clear that we weren't discussing their stubborn father or my demanding grandfather. We were talking about a human being who needed medical intervention they were actively preventing. My father's face cycled through several expressions before settling on defeated anger. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth. "But this is on you when he gets worse from all this stress." We moved through the house in a small procession. The air inside was stale and heavy, thick with the smell of closed windows and something else. Something medicinal and sour that made my stomach clench. The living room curtains were drawn tight, creating an artificial twilight that felt more like a tomb than a place where someone was supposed to be recovering. Grandpa Joe was slumped in his recliner, a thin blanket pulled up to his chin despite the warmth of the day. When he heard our footsteps, he turned his head slowly, and I had to fight to keep my expression neutral. The man who'd taught me to drive a stick shift and change my own oil looked like he'd aged a decade in the 3 months since I'd last seen him. His cheeks were hollow, his skin gray with that particular pallor that comes from serious illness. But his eyes were still sharp, still alert, and when he saw me in my dress uniform, something like relief flickered across his features. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You came." I knelt beside his chair, careful not to disturb the blanket. "Grandpa Joe, I'm here to take you somewhere they can help you feel better. These are medical professionals, and they're going to take good care of you." He nodded slowly, then shifted his gaze to Sergeant Williams. "Doctor?" he asked. "Not a doctor, sir, but I work with them. We're going to get you to people who can figure out what's making you feel so poorly." Williams's voice carried the kind of gentle authority that probably comforted families in crisis situations every day. My mother hovered in the doorway, wringing her hands. "He doesn't like being moved around," she said. "It upsets him. Last time we took him to the doctor, he was confused for days afterward." I stood and faced her directly. "When was the last time you took him to a doctor?" She hesitated, looking to my father for support. "A few months ago, maybe 6 months. He said he felt fine." Looking at Grandpa Joe now, curled under his blanket with labored breathing and obvious weight loss, the idea that he'd claimed to feel fine 6 months ago seemed impossible. More likely they'd decided he felt fine and stopped asking questions that might complicate their narrative. Sergeant Williams and his partner, Corporal Jenkins, moved with practiced efficiency. They checked Grandpa Joe's vital signs, asked gentle questions about his symptoms, and prepared their transport equipment. Every few seconds, Williams would glance at his readings and frown slightly. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would alarm a civilian observer, but enough to tell me that the numbers weren't good. "Sir," Williams said to my grandfather, "we're going to help you sit up and get you onto our stretcher. It's going to be more comfortable than this chair, and we'll keep you warm on the ride to the hospital." "Hospital?" My father's voice cracked slightly on the word. "He doesn't need a hospital. He needs rest and quiet." Corporal Jenkins looked up from where he was adjusting the portable stretcher. "Sir, with respect, his oxygen saturation is below normal limits. His blood pressure is concerning. These aren't things that improve with rest alone." The medical terminology seemed to hit my parents like a foreign language they couldn't translate. Oxygen saturation, blood pressure, clinical terms that made clear this wasn't about comfort or family preferences. This was about measurable, quantifiable medical conditions that required professional intervention. As we helped Grandpa Joe from his chair to the stretcher, I noticed how little he weighed. His arms felt fragile under my hands, like bird bones wrapped in loose skin. The man who'd once carried me on his shoulders, who'd taught me that strength came from showing up when things got difficult, had been reduced to this frail shadow while my parents watched and called it rest. The neighbors were still gathered on the street when we emerged from the house. Mrs. Patterson from next door stepped forward, her face creased with concern. "Is Joe all right?" she asked. "We haven't seen him in weeks." My mother's voice was sharp. "He's fine, just a routine checkup." But Mrs. Patterson's eyes were fixed on the stretcher, on the oxygen mask Sergeant Williams had placed over Grandpa Joe's face, on the IV line Corporal Jenkins was monitoring. This wasn't routine anything, and everyone watching knew it. I walked alongside the stretcher as we loaded Grandpa Joe into the ambulance. His eyes found mine through the clear plastic of the oxygen mask, and I saw something there that made my chest tight. Gratitude, yes, but also an apology. As if he was sorry for putting me in a position where I had to choose between family harmony and his life. I squeezed his hand gently. "Don't apologize for needing help," I said quietly. "That's what family is supposed to do." Before I climbed into the ambulance, I turned back to my parents. They stood on their front porch like actors who'd forgotten their lines, uncertain how to perform for an audience that was no longer buying their script. "You can meet us at the VA hospital," I said evenly. "Or you can stay here and explain to everyone why you thought watching him deteriorate was preferable to getting him help." The drive to the hospital took 23 minutes. I know because I counted every one of them, watching Sergeant Williams monitor Grandpa Joe's vital signs and adjust his oxygen flow. Every few minutes, Williams would make notes on his chart, his expression growing more serious. "How bad is it?" I asked finally. Williams glanced at his partner, then back at me. "Bad enough that waiting another week might have been too long. His breathing is labored, he's showing signs of dehydration, and his heart rate suggests his body is working overtime to compensate for something." The VA hospital emergency department was ready for us. Dr. Sarah Chen met us at the ambulance bay with a team of nurses and technicians who moved with the kind of coordinated precision that told me this facility knew how to handle serious cases. As they wheeled Grandpa Joe through the automatic doors, I caught a glimpse of my parents' car pulling into the parking lot. They'd followed after all, though whether from genuine concern or fear of how their absence might look to the neighbors, I couldn't say. Dr. Chen was thorough and direct. She ordered blood work, chest x-rays, an EKG, and a complete metabolic panel. As the results came back, her expression grew increasingly grim. "Pneumonia," she told me an hour later, "severe dehydration, signs of early heart failure, probably secondary to the infection. His electrolytes are completely out of balance." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "How long has he been sick?" "Based on the progression I'm seeing, at least 3 to 4 weeks, maybe longer." This didn't happen overnight. 3 to 4 weeks. The same time frame my cousin had described. The same period during which my parents had been turning away visitors and canceling medical appointments. They'd watched him decline for a month and called it rest. "Is he going to be all right?" I asked. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. "He should be, with proper treatment. But if you'd waited much longer to bring him in, we might be having a very different conversation." When my parents finally appeared in the emergency department waiting room, they looked smaller somehow, diminished. The authority they'd wielded in their own home had evaporated in the face of medical equipment and professional healthcare providers who didn't care about their opinions on what constituted appropriate care. They approached me cautiously, my mother's voice tentative. "How is he?" "He has pneumonia," I said without preamble. "Severe dehydration. Early heart failure. Dr. Chen says if we'd waited another week, he might not have made it." The color drained from my father's face, but he seemed fine this morning, tired, but fine. I stared at him for a long moment, wondering if he actually believed what he was saying, or if denial had become so automatic that he'd lost track of reality entirely. "He wasn't fine," I said quietly. "He hasn't been fine for weeks. And you knew it." The silence in that hospital waiting room stretched between us like a chasm that couldn't be bridged with excuses or explanations. My mother fidgeted with her purse strap, eyes darting everywhere except toward my face. My father stared at the floor tiles, as if their pattern held answers to questions he wasn't ready to ask. Dr. Chen emerged from the treatment area with a clipboard and the kind of expression medical professionals wear when they're about to deliver news that changes everything. She gestured toward a small consultation room off the main waiting area, and we followed her like reluctant students called to the principal's office. "Your grandfather is stable," she began, settling into her chair with practiced efficiency. "But I need you to understand how serious this situation was. The pneumonia has progressed to a stage where his lungs were struggling to provide adequate oxygen. His kidneys were beginning to show signs of strain from dehydration. If this had continued untreated for another 72 hours, we could have been looking at organ failure." My mother's hands trembled slightly as she processed the words. Organ failure. The phrase hung in the air like smoke from something burning, impossible to ignore or wave away. "But he was eating," my father said weakly. "Just yesterday he had soup." Dr. Chen consulted her notes. "When did he last have a substantial meal? Not soup or liquids, but actual food?" The pause that followed was answer enough. My parents exchanged glances, each waiting for the other to provide a timeline they couldn't construct because they hadn't been paying attention to the details that mattered. "I don't remember exactly," my mother admitted. "Maybe a week ago?" "He said he wasn't hungry." "Loss of appetite is a symptom, not a preference," Dr. Chen explained gently. "When elderly patients stop eating, especially combined with respiratory symptoms and lethargy, it's a medical emergency, not a lifestyle choice." The weight of professional judgment settled over my parents like a heavy blanket. They were learning what I'd known from the moment I saw those authorization papers 3 years ago. When medical decisions need to be made, good intentions aren't enough. Knowledge matters. Training matters. The ability to recognize when comfort becomes negligence matters most of all. "What happens now?" I asked. "We'll keep him for at least 48 hours, Dr. Chen replied. "IV antibiotics, oxygen therapy, cardiac monitoring. Once the pneumonia responds to treatment, we'll evaluate his overall condition and develop a discharge plan. Given the severity of his condition when he arrived, I'm recommending a cardiology consultation as well." My father shifted uncomfortably. "How much is all this going to cost?" The question revealed everything I needed to know about their priorities. Not how long will he need to stay, or what can we do to help his recovery, or will there be lasting effects? The first concern was financial, the bottom line that had probably influenced their decision to keep him home in the first place. "Medicare will cover most of it," Dr. Chen said. "But that's not really the issue here. The issue is ensuring he receives proper follow-up care and that someone is monitoring his condition appropriately." She turned to me. "As his medical power of attorney, you'll need to be involved in all discharge planning. We'll also need to discuss home health services, medication management, and regular checkups to prevent this from happening again." I nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my shoulders, like a familiar pack. This was what Grandpa Joe had trusted me to do. Not just rescue him from this immediate crisis, but ensure his long-term welfare remained in competent hands. "Can we see him?" my mother asked, her voice small. Dr. Chen glanced at her watch. "He's resting now, but you can visit briefly. Keep in mind that he's still quite weak, and we want to minimize stress during the initial treatment period." We walked down the corridor toward the cardiac unit, our footsteps echoing off polished floors that smelled of disinfectant and possibility. Through the doorway of room 314, I could see Grandpa Joe propped up in bed, oxygen cannula in place, IV line snaking down to his arm. But his color was already better, and his breathing looked less labored. When he saw us enter, his eyes brightened with something approaching his old spark. "Sarah," he said, his voice stronger than it had been that morning. "You really did it." I pulled a chair close to his bedside. "How are you feeling?" "Like I can breathe again," he admitted. Didn't realize how bad it had gotten until they started fixing it. My parents hovered near the foot of the bed, uncertain how to navigate this new dynamic where their authority had been transferred to medical professionals and their daughter. They looked like visitors in their own family story, unsure of their lines. "Dad," my mother said tentatively, "we were worried about you." Grandpa Joe studied her face for a long moment. "Worried enough to bring me here?" The question cut through pretense like a scalpel. My parents had been worried enough to hover and fuss and make excuses, but not worried enough to seek actual medical intervention. Their concern had been performative rather than practical. "We thought you wanted to stay home," my father offered weakly. "I wanted to get better," Grandpa Joe replied simply. Staying home wasn't working. A nurse appeared in the doorway to check his vitals, and we stepped back to give her room to work. She moved with efficient kindness, adjusting his oxygen flow and making notes on her tablet. Her presence reminded everyone in the room that this was now a medical situation managed by professionals, not a family disagreement that could be resolved through stubbornness or good intentions. "His numbers are improving nicely," she told Dr. Chen, who had followed us to the room. "Temperature's coming down, oxygen saturation is up to 94%. "That's excellent progress," Dr. Chen said. She turned to address all of us. "The antibiotics are working, which means we caught this in time. But I want to emphasize that delay in treatment could have had very different outcomes." My mother's eyes filled with tears for the first time since this ordeal began. "We didn't know," she whispered. "We thought we were doing what was best." Dr. Chen's expression softened slightly. Medical decision-making is complicated, especially for family members. That's why legal documents like power of attorney exist. When emotions run high, it helps to have someone designated to make clinical decisions based on medical need rather than family dynamics. The words stung because they were true. My parents had been making decisions based on their own fear, their own discomfort with hospitals and medical procedures, their own denial about aging and mortality. They'd convinced themselves that keeping Grandpa Joe comfortable at home was kindness, when it was actually a form of abandonment disguised as care. Over the next hour, we established new ground rules. I would be the primary contact for all medical decisions. My parents could visit and provide emotional support, but treatment plans would be developed between medical professionals and me. Any concerns about his care would be directed through proper channels rather than family arguments in hospital corridors. It felt strange to be making these pronouncements to people who had changed my diapers and taught me to ride a bicycle. But authority isn't inherited through blood relationships. It's earned through competence, preparation, and the willingness to make difficult decisions when they need to be made. As evening approached, my parents prepared to leave. They moved slowly, reluctantly, as if walking out of the hospital meant accepting that their version of events had been thoroughly debunked by medical reality. At the doorway, my father turned back. "Sarah," he said, his voice heavy with something that might have been regret. "We really thought we were protecting him." "I know," I replied, "but protection that prevents necessary care isn't protection at all. It's something else entirely." They left without arguing because there was nothing left to argue about. The medical evidence was overwhelming, the legal authority was clear, and their neighbors had witnessed the ambulance removal that made their previous explanations impossible to maintain. I stayed with Grandpa Joe until visiting hours ended, watching his color improve as the IV antibiotics did their work. His breathing grew easier, his voice stronger, his eyes brighter with each passing hour. The transformation was remarkable and heartbreaking because it proved how unnecessary his suffering had been. "You saved my life today," he said as I prepared to leave. "You saved mine first," I replied. "When you trusted me with those papers 3 years ago, you gave me the authority to do what needed doing. Without that, I would have been just another family member arguing in the hallway." He smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in months. "Your grandmother would be proud. She always said you had steel in your spine when it counted." Driving home through the quiet suburban streets where my parents lived, I passed neighbors who had witnessed the afternoon's events. Some waved tentatively from their porches. Others pretended not to see my car. Word would spread, as it always does in small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. My phone buzzed, with text messages from family members who had heard various versions of what happened. My cousin Mark wrote simply, "Thank you for doing what needed to be done." My Aunt Carol sent, "Is Dad really okay? Your parents are saying it was all unnecessary." The narrative war had already begun. My parents would spend the coming weeks trying to reframe the story, minimizing the severity of Grandpa Joe's condition, emphasizing their good intentions, portraying my intervention as dramatic overreach by a daughter who didn't understand the full situation. But I had something they didn't have: medical documentation, hospital records, professional assessments that couldn't be argued away or reinterpreted through the lens of family politics. Dr. Chen's notes would become part of Grandpa Joe's permanent medical record, creating an official account of his condition and the circumstances that led to his hospitalization. More importantly, I had witnesses: the neighbors who saw the ambulance, the medical professionals who treated him. The documentation that proved legal authority had been properly exercised in a life-threatening situation. The truth has a way of surviving family spin when it's backed by evidence and witnessed by people outside the circle of denial. My parents could try to revise history, but they couldn't change the fact that their version of appropriate care had nearly killed the man they claimed to be protecting. As I pulled into my driveway, I thought about the conversation I would need to have with Grandpa Joe's discharge planning team. Home health services, medication management, regular follow-up appointments, a support system that wouldn't rely solely on people who had already proven their judgment was dangerously flawed. This wasn't over. Saving his life had been the first step, but ensuring his ongoing welfare would require sustained vigilance and the kind of planning that my parents had consistently avoided. The difference was that now I had legal authority to implement necessary changes without requiring their permission or cooperation. Tomorrow I would begin building a care network that prioritized medical need over family comfort. Tonight, I allowed myself to feel the satisfaction of a mission accomplished and the weight of responsibility for everything that came next. The lesson my parents needed to learn wasn't just about respecting medical authority or acknowledging legal documents. It was about the difference between caring and controlling, between protection and neglect, between love that serves the beloved and love that serves the self. Whether they learned it or not, Grandpa Joe would receive the care he deserved. That was the promise I'd made when I accepted power of attorney, and it was the promise I intended to keep, regardless of family politics or neighborhood gossip. The next morning brought the kind of clarity that only comes after a storm has passed, and the debris needs to be cleared. I arrived at the hospital, early, before visiting hours officially began, because medical facilities have rhythms that work better when you understand them. Night shift nurses finishing their reports, day shift doctors making rounds. The quiet efficiency of a place where healing happens in measured doses. Grandpa Joe was awake when I slipped into his room, sitting up in bed with a breakfast tray that actually looked touched. The oxygen cannula was still in place, but his color had improved dramatically overnight. The gray pallor that had frightened me yesterday was replaced by something approaching his natural complexion. "Morning, soldier," he said with a grin that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with his stories when I was 7 years old. "Morning, sir," I replied, settling into the visitor's chair. "How's the chow?" "Better than field rations," he said, taking another spoonful of oatmeal. "First real appetite I've had in weeks. Funny how being able to breathe makes everything taste better." Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway with a tablet and the kind of expression that suggested good news, tempered by realistic caution. She pulled up a second chair and consulted her notes with the thoroughness I'd learned to appreciate in military briefings. "The pneumonia is responding well to antibiotics," she began. "His oxygen levels have stabilized, and the chest X-ray this morning shows significant improvement. We're not out of the woods yet, but we're moving in the right direction." "What's the timeline?" I asked. "Another day or two of IV antibiotics, then we'll transition to oral medications. The bigger concern is preventing this from happening again. His immune system has been compromised, probably from malnutrition and dehydration. We need to address those underlying issues before discharge." I pulled out the small notebook I'd brought, the same kind I used for mission planning overseas. "What does that look like practically?" Dr. Chen appreciated the direct approach. "Home health services for the first few weeks, a visiting nurse to monitor his medications and watch for complications, physical therapy to rebuild strength, and most importantly, regular follow-up appointments that actually happen." The emphasis on that last point wasn't subtle. We both understood that previous medical care had been sporadic at best, non-existent at worst. "I'll coordinate all of that," I said. "What about family involvement?" She glanced toward the hallway where my parents had appeared yesterday like actors who'd forgotten their blocking. "That's really up to you as his medical proxy. They can certainly visit and provide emotional support, but medical decisions need to go through you." Grandpa Joe had been listening quietly, but now he shifted forward slightly. "Sarah, I don't want this to tear the family apart. Your parents made mistakes, but they're still family." His voice carried the kind of wisdom that comes from decades of watching people choose between being right and being kind. But this wasn't about family harmony anymore. This was about preventing a repeat performance that might not have such a fortunate outcome. "They'll always be family," I said carefully, "but they don't get to make medical decisions anymore. That's not punishment. That's just reality based on demonstrated judgment." Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. Medical decision-making requires a certain detachment from emotional investment. Family members are often too close to the situation to make purely clinical choices. A soft knock interrupted our conversation. My parents stood in the doorway, looking uncertain about whether they were welcome. My mother carried a small vase of flowers from what I recognized as her own garden. My father held a newspaper and wore the kind of careful expression people adopt when they're not sure of their reception. "Come in," Grandpa Joe said warmly. "Sarah and I were just talking with the doctor about next steps." They entered cautiously, as if the room might contain landmines hidden beneath the cheerful hospital linens. My mother placed the flowers on the bedside table with the careful attention of someone performing a ritual they hoped might restore normal relationships. "How are you feeling today, Dad?" she asked, her voice smaller than usual. "Much better," he replied honestly. "The medicine is working and I can breathe without feeling like I'm drowning." The metaphor hit my parents visibly. Drowning. It was a word that made clear how serious his condition had been, how close they'd come to losing him, while they debated the merits of medical intervention. Dr. Chen used their arrival as an opportunity to provide family education that felt more like gentle correction. "Pneumonia in elderly patients can progress rapidly," she explained. "What looks like simple tiredness can mask serious respiratory compromise. That's why regular medical monitoring is so important for this age group." My father shifted uncomfortably. "We thought we were watching him carefully." "Watching and medically monitoring are different things," Dr. Chen replied without judgment. "Medical monitoring involves vital signs, blood work, professional assessment. Family observation is important for quality of life, but it's not a substitute for clinical evaluation." The distinction was crucial and had been the source of their catastrophic miscalculation. They'd confused emotional attention with medical oversight, assuming that concern could substitute for competence. "What's the plan going forward?" my mother asked, directing the question to Dr. Chen but glancing nervously toward me. "That's really for Sarah to coordinate," Dr. Chen said smoothly. "As his medical power of attorney, she'll be working with our discharge planning team to arrange follow-up care." The reminder of my authority settled over the room like morning fog, visible but not necessarily welcome. My parents were still adjusting to the reality that their opinions about his care had become advisory rather than decisive. I spent the next hour outlining the support system that would need to be in place before Grandpa Joe could safely return home. Home health nursing, medication management systems, regular cardiology follow-ups, physical therapy to rebuild strength, a medical alert system in case of emergencies. Each item on the list represented a recognition that informal family care had proven inadequate for someone with serious health conditions. Professional oversight wasn't a luxury or an overreaction. It was a necessity demonstrated by recent events. My parents listened without arguing, though I could see my father calculating costs in his head. The financial reality of proper elder care was daunting, but it was also non-negotiable. Grandpa Joe's VA benefits would cover most medical expenses, and I was prepared to supplement whatever gaps remained. Money had clearly been a factor in their previous decisions, though they'd never admitted it directly. The cost of regular doctor visits, prescription medications, potential diagnostic tests. It was easier to convince themselves he was fine than to face the financial implications of acknowledging he wasn't. But false economy in healthcare has its own costs, as yesterday's emergency had proven. An ounce of prevention being worth a pound of cure wasn't just a saying. It was a mathematical reality backed by insurance actuaries and medical statistics. By afternoon, the discharge planning team had assembled a comprehensive care package that would take effect when Grandpa Joe was medically cleared to leave the hospital. A visiting nurse would check on him 3 times a week initially. Physical therapy would begin within 72 hours of discharge. His medications would be organized into daily pill dispensers with clear instructions. Most importantly, I would be the primary contact for all medical providers. Any changes in his condition, any concerns about his care, any decisions about treatment modifications would go through me rather than through family members whose judgment had already proven unreliable. This wasn't about excluding my parents from his life. It was about ensuring that love and good intentions were backed by medical competence and legal authority to act when action was needed. That evening, I sat in Grandpa Joe's room as visiting hours wound down, watching him work on a crossword puzzle with the kind of focused attention that had been absent during his weeks of decline. His mind was sharp again, his hands steady, his breathing easy. "You know they're going to resent this arrangement," he said without looking up from his puzzle. "Probably," I agreed, "but resentment is better than regret. I'd rather have them angry at me for saving your life than forgiving them for letting you die." He set down his pen and looked at me directly. "Your grandmother used to say that sometimes love means making decisions other people can't make for themselves. I never understood what she meant until now." The weight of that responsibility settled around me like a familiar uniform. Heavy, but worn with purpose. This was what I'd signed up for when I accepted power of attorney. Not just the authority to make decisions, but the obligation to make the right ones regardless of family politics or emotional comfort. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Coordinating care teams, managing medications, ensuring that the support systems we'd put in place actually functioned as intended. But tonight, listening to Grandpa Joe's steady breathing and watching his fingers work confidently across the crossword grid, I felt the deep satisfaction of a mission accomplished. The lesson my parents had learned wasn't just about respecting legal documents or acknowledging medical authority. It was about the difference between caring and controlling, between protection and neglect, between love that serves the beloved and love that serves the comfortable illusions of the caregiver. Whether they fully absorbed that lesson remained to be seen. But Grandpa Joe would receive the care he deserved, monitored by professionals who understood the difference between comfort and medical necessity. That was the promise I'd made when I accepted power of attorney, and it was the promise I intended to keep regardless of family dynamics or financial considerations. The phone calls would start tomorrow. Relatives wanting to know what really happened. Neighbors curious about the ambulance and the family drama. Extended family members taking sides based on incomplete information and personal loyalties. I was prepared for all of it. The whispered conversations about whether I'd overreacted. The subtle suggestions that I'd embarrassed the family unnecessarily. The careful questions about whether military training had made me too aggressive in civilian situations. But I had something more powerful than family opinion. I had medical documentation, professional assessments, legal authority properly exercised in a life-threatening situation. The truth backed by evidence and witnessed by people whose job it was to save lives rather than preserve family harmony. Most importantly, I had Grandpa Joe sitting up in bed, breathing easily, working crossword puzzles, and planning for a future that had nearly been cut short by well-intentioned negligence disguised as loving care. Care. The discharge came on a Friday morning with paperwork that felt like victory wrapped in medical terminology. Dr. Chen handed me a folder thick with instructions, prescriptions, and follow-up appointments scheduled with the precision of a military operation. Grandpa Joe sat on the edge of his hospital bed, dressed in clean clothes my parents had finally brought, looking more like himself than he had in months. His color was good, his breathing was steady. The antibiotics had cleared the infection that had been slowly killing him, while my parents called it rest. But the real transformation wasn't just physical. There was something in his eyes that reminded me of the man who'd taught me to fish, to drive, to stand up for what mattered even when it was hard. The ride home was quiet, peaceful in a way that felt earned rather than given. I'd arranged for the medical transport to bring him back, Not because he needed an ambulance anymore, but because I wanted my parents to see the same uniforms, the same official vehicles, the same professional competence that had saved his life. A reminder that this wasn't over. When we pulled into the driveway, the street looked different somehow. Neighbors who had scattered when the ambulance arrived 3 days earlier now lingered on porches and sidewalks, drawn by curiosity about the man who'd been carried out on a stretcher and was returning on his own feet. Their presence felt like an audience for the final act of a play that had started with my parents' denial and was ending with my authority. That afternoon, as I watched Grandpa Joe settle back into his familiar chair with a cup of coffee he could actually taste, I realized the lesson had been taught and learned. My parents moved around him with a careful attention they'd never shown before, checking if he needed anything, making sure his medications were organized, speaking to him instead of about him. The power dynamic had shifted permanently, not through anger or revenge, but through the simple demonstration of what competent care looked like when lives hung in the balance. Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons or words, but with paperwork, professional uniforms, and the quiet authority that comes from knowing the difference between love and neglect. My parents had learned that lesson the hard way, and they would never forget it.